Welcome back, everyone. To recap, in part 1 of this video, on top of ranting for a few minutes, I discussed the causes of the American Civil War from the Union's perspective up through about 1848. If you have not already, watch part 1. If you have already done so, let's continue. After the Mexican-American War, the U.S. annexed much western land. However, this land brought about the ugly question of slavery. There were many proposals as to what to do about this new land. Prohibit slavery in all of it, extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific, or allow the people of each territory to decide for themselves. In the end, the Compromise of 1850 was enacted. There were many stipulations, but here are the main two we will focus on. It allowed California to enter as a free state in exchange for strengthening fugitive slave laws, returning runaway slaves to their owners. By admitting California as a free state, it finally broke the balance of power in the Senate, upsetting the South. Meanwhile, the fugitive slave law infuriated us. I have no idea how this proposal passed Congress. Regardless, instead of settling the issue, it only inflamed it. Sidetracking a bit, let's talk about states' rights. Basically, this is the idea that the authority of the individual states superseded the power of the federal government. Of course, this ties back into slavery and secession. To best sum up the argument, let's quote Arthur M. Schlesinger's summary on the topic. From the close of the nullification episode of 1832 to 1833 to the outbreak of the Civil War, the agitation of state rights was intimately connected with the new issue of growing importance, the slavery question, and the principal form assumed by the doctrine was the right of secession. The pro-slavery forces sought refuge in the state rights position as a shield against federal interference with pro-slavery projects. As a natural consequence, anti-slavery legislatures in the North were led to lay great stress on the national character of the Union and the broad powers of the general government in dealing with slavery. Nevertheless, it is significant to note that when it served anti-slavery purposes better to lapse into state rights dialectic, Northern legislatures did not hesitate to be inconsistent. Another addition to this issue, as stated, we were growing far more rapidly than the South. Thus, it was only a matter of time before we controlled the federal government. Thus, the South fought for a strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution that would limit federal power over states. With our side growing and the losing of the equality in the Senate, the South felt it must win this in order to survive. Well, there was always secession. Dun dun dun! Anyways, back to politics. In 1854, the issue of slavery was brought up yet again when Senator Stephen A. Douglas proposed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Basically, it said that people of new territories had the right to decide the issue of slavery, not the politicians. Thus, it promoted the use of popular sovereignty. In essence, this destroyed the past 50 years' worth of legislature on the issue and led to all hell breaking loose. Moving to a tangent briefly, from 1828 to 1854, America had some political stability through its two-party system. There were two major parties, like today, the Democrats and the Whigs. Unlike today, parties were not sectional, appealing to only one region. Both parties tried to appeal to Americans both North and South. However, the Whigs had a weakness. They couldn't agree on a platform on slavery. Thus, as long as the slavery issue was ignored, they could run a successful campaign. However, with the reopening of the slavery issue, the Whig Party, for all intents and purposes, fell apart. Thus, the two-party system fell apart and many small parties appeared. By the 1850s, politicians were acting in a society in which the traditional restraints of the two-party system that suppressed sectional conflict had largely been eroded away. At the same time, democracy was experiencing a rapid expansion as voter qualifications were reduced. This, in turn, led to an era when the mass political party roused voter participation to 80 or 90% turnout rate, and a time in which politics formed an essential component of American mass culture. Basically, traditional politics had kept the slavery issue maintained. Destroy the old two-party political system and infuse it with common people who have no idea what they're doing and inflame the issue instead of skillfully managing it, and all hell is going to break loose. Tying these last two ideas together, upset at the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party was formed on the platform on forbidding the expansion of slavery. Their ideas of free labor appealed to a rapidly growing middle class who had and hoped to, quote, make it, end quote. Basically, it meant becoming successful through hard work. Before moving on, I must note that the Republican Party was the first entirely sectional major party in U.S. history. As I said, before this, both parties tried to appease all regions of the nations. The Republicans explicitly supported us and might have well given the South a middle finger. I'm exaggerating a bit, but you get the point. I will talk more about the Republicans later, but let's summarize the situation in America on a national level. Ethno-religious, socio-economic, and cultural fault lines that had been running throughout American society became increasingly divided, pitting Yankee Northern Protestants with a stake in the emerging industrial capitalism and American nationalism increasingly against those tied to Southern slaveholding interests. Moving on. At this time, many settlers were pouring into the new Kansas Territory. Long story short, violence erupted in the new territory. However, despite popular belief, the conflict that ensued, known as Bleeding Kansas, was not primarily one of ideologies over slavery, but more so of land-hungry Westerners indifferent to public issues who competed over the best land. Despite this, Bleeding Kansas became a symbol of sectional controversy, as both the South and us accused the other for causing violence in Kansas. Regardless, the proposed Lecompton Constitution would allow slavery in Kansas. However, this was the result of massive vote fraud, and it was quickly revoked. The president at the time, James Buchanan, tried to admit Kansas as a slave state under the Lecompton Constitution. Considering it was based on fraud and perverted the policy of popular sovereignty, this did not go well. His attempt failed, but it deepened a rift within the Democratic Party, which itself was starting to divide over the issue of slavery. I might as well add it eventually entered the Union as a free state. Moving on. In addition, there was the famous Dred Scott case, in which it was declared that blacks were, quote, so far inferior that they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect, end quote, and that slavery could spread into territories even if the majority of people in the territories were anti-slavery. We, infuriated by this, felt that it would only be a matter of time before slavery was imposed on the North itself in an attempt of slave owners to protect their property. By the mid-1850s, things were deteriorating fairly quickly at this point. Things got so bad that fights ensued between pro-North and pro-South congressmen. For example, in 1856, anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner was beaten with a cane by pro-slavery Preston S. Brooks after he gave an anti-slavery speech in Congress. Back to the Republican Party. Although they lost the 1856 election, they figured out a method to win. If they focused on the issue of slavery, they could keep the dividing Democratic Party, well, divided. They could also rally popular support up here. By doing this, they could garner enough votes to win the 1860 election. In order to do this, though, they began to eschew moral attacks on slavery for political and economic arguments, giving the South the middle finger. Instead of trying to quell sectional tensions, they threw a stick of dynamite into it. Before moving on, there is a quote that ties them up. Republicans believed in the existence of the slave power conspiracy, which had seized control of the federal government and attempting to pervert the Constitution for its own purposes. The slave power idea gave the Republicans the anti-aristocratic appeal with which men like Seward had long wished to be associated politically. By fusing older anti-slavery arguments with the idea that slavery posed a threat to Northern free labor and democratic values, it enabled the Republicans to tap into the egalitarian outlook which lay at the heart of Northern society. In the end, the organizers of the party did an effective job of shaping the party's policy to gain as much support as possible. Let's see, I'm not trying to get too bogged down in detail, but at the same time not omit anything of importance. In 1857, there were economic difficulties. This strengthened the Republican Party, who blamed it on low tariffs that supported the South. Meanwhile, the South was convinced by the situation that they had grown too reliant on Eastern financial interests. In 1858, there were the Lincoln-Douglas debates, in which Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas fought over a Senate seat. Long story short, Lincoln lost but gained widespread popularity. Meanwhile, Douglas's position only helped split the Democratic Party even further. In 1859, there was a raid by John Brown who attempted to start an armed slave revolt. He failed and was hanged, but this only further divided the nation. On to the election of 1860. Long story short, Lincoln was nominated for the Republican Party. The Democratic Party finally split along the slavery issue, specifically on the demand for a federal slave code. In the end, Lincoln won the election handily. Even if all his opponents combined their ballots, Lincoln still would have won. Even though none of the southern states voted for him, he still won. With the election of Lincoln, the South felt their power in national politics was rapidly degrading. The Democratic Party, which had been seen increasingly as supporting the South, was weakening. Basically, the 1860s election was a watershed moment in the balance of power of competing national and parochial interests and affiliations, all to the South's detriments. When the South found out, 7 states seceded: South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. They, in turn, formed the Confederate States of America. After Lincoln called for troops in April, 4 more seceded: Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. The upper southern states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, were caught in the middle. According to us, they wanted to keep their slaves, but if they seceded, they would be in the middle of the ensuing conflict. They stayed with us, hoping their slave rights would be protected. Other issues for secession, such as tariffs and states' rights, are disregarded by most historians, though we will get into that next section. The way we see it, the South seceded because of uncompromising differences between the free and slave states over the power of the national government to prohibit slavery in the territories that had not yet become states. Now then, the stage has been set. On one side there is us, and on the other, the Confederacy. How did war erupt? Well, after South Carolina seceded, Major Robert Anderson, a loyal Unionist, occupied Fort Sumter in the middle of Charleston Harbor, the major harbor of South Carolina. The South was outraged by this act, which they considered illegal. We praised it as an act against secession. When the Confederate government took charge in February of 1861, the new president, Jefferson Davis, ordered the fort be taken. Long story short, on April 12th, the Confederates opened fire on Fort Sumter. 2 days later, the fort surrendered. The battle began the American Civil War, as an overwhelming demand for war swept both the South and us, with only Kentucky attempting to remain neutral. There are two main competing explanations for the sectional tensions that led to this moment. One was that the war was needless, and that sectional hostility was the accidental, unnecessary work of self-interested or fanatical agitators. Others argue that the conflict was irrepressible, and thought the war appeared to be a stark moral conflict in which the South was to blame, a conflict that arose as a result of the designs of slave power. I could go into which of these two ideologies are more correct, but that would take all day. Now, before I end this, let me talk a little more on why the war started. I talked ample about leading up to the war in Fort Sumter. However, I haven't explained why there was a war at all. When the South seceded, incoming President Abraham Lincoln argued that the Constitution was a more perfect union than the earlier Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, that it was a binding contract, and called any secession legally void. In essence, when the 13 colonies formed the United States, it was a binding contract. It wasn't like the European Union, wherein you can enter and leave at leisure. If you joined, you were a member for life. Secession, in his eyes, was illegal. You could not do it. Also, to him, the Founding Fathers wanted to create a permanent union. If he just let the South go, he would simply be giving up on the Founding Fathers' dream. I would go more into the legality of secession and state sovereignty, but I will save that for another episode. More pragmatically, he feared secession would discredit democracy and create a fatal precedent that would eventually fragment the no longer United States into several small, squabbling countries. If the South can simply walk out of the country, what is to stop other portions to walk out later over whatever little squabble? When the South raided federal institutions and attacked Fort Sumter, it rallied the North to the defense of American nationalism. It was the match that lit the proverbial powder keg. Thus, there are two ways to look at it. One, the war had to be fought rather than let the nation perish, aka save the Union. The other is best stated by Abraham Lincoln. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and another would accept war rather than let it perish, and the war came. Basically, according to this view held by most of us up here, the South pulled the first punch and attacked the Union and thus caused the war. Okay then. That was a lot to go through. I think I hit the main points. I'm sorry for jumping around between politics, economics, cultures, theories, etc. It is just really hard to organize 2,000 pages worth of information into a 10-minute video with any sense of logic or continuity. Regardless, this is the timeline from the Northern perspective that resulted in the American Civil War, both the cause for secession and the cause for the war itself. However, as I said, this is the North's perspective. Now it is time to see what the South has to say about this seemingly damning evidence. If you're interested in knowing the South's side of the story, please join me for the next episode of A Pony Perspective. Until then, I'm going to lie down.